So in the previous videos, we talked about how to figure out how many protons, how to figure out how many neutrons, how to figure out how many electrons there were. We also talked about isotopes, which are going to be variations of elements that have different numbers of neutrons in them. Well, electrons are kind of like neutrons in that they're not fixed. So an element can have different versions of it based on the number of electrons that there are. So every once in a while, an element will give up an electron or it will pick up an electron. Sorry, I got my dog barking there, but so electrons are floating around the orbit, the nucleus in orbits. Okay, the next lecture video is going to talk about how they're actually arranged in those orbits. But we assume that unless noted, elements are going to be neutrally charged, so the number of electrons is going to equal the number of protons. But every once in a while, an element will give up an electron or it will pick up an electron, giving it either more of a negative charge or giving it more of a positive charge. So what happens is that any kind of element that has a charge is called an ion. Okay, I probably should have typed that on there, but an ion is going to be an element with a charge. Okay, there are two different types of ions. Okay, there are cations and there are anions. An anion is an element that is going to be negatively charged because it's picked up some electrons, right? It's gained some of those negatively charged particles, so it's going to become overall more negatively charged. And you can tell an anion because up here we put a subscript that shows that it's negative, meaning that it picked up electrons, and then how many electrons it picked up. So in this case, chlorine picked up 1 electron. We don't put the 1 on there, we just assume it's 1 if there's no other number. In this case, nitrogen picked up 3 electrons. Okay, and that's what the 3 negative means. I always remember anions are negative, and anions have the N in there and N for negative. Handy dandy tool to help you keep track. Okay, now sometimes an element will give up electrons, thus because it's getting rid of negative charges, it's going to become more positive. So two common cations, which are positively charged ions, are going to be sodium. Sodium would have picked up 1 or gotten rid of 1 electron. And here's barium. Barium in this case, again, 2+, meaning that it gave up 2 electrons. And so that's how we can tell whether or not an element has different amounts of electrons in it than it should, the normal amount, which would equal the amount of protons. So by looking at that subscript, we can figure out if it's an anion or a cation. And again, handy dandy tool, cation has a T, which looks like a plus sign. So these are going to be positively charged. Positively charged ions are going to give up electrons, and negatively charged ones will pick up electrons. And this is going to be really important when we talk about bonding. So like table salt is NaCl. Well, what happens is that in order for this, the reason why these two compounds, these two elements will bind together is because opposites attract, right? The sodium's actually going to give, remember sodium is +1, it's going to give one of its electrons to chlorine, making it -1. And so that interaction between the two is what allows those two to become chemically bound together. And we'll talk about a lot about that in the next units. So an ion is an element with a charge, an overall charge, either positive or negative. If it's a negative charge, it's called an anion, and that means it's picked up electrons. And if it's a positively charged element, it's a cation, which means it's given up electrons.